This is video 1 of chapter 8. From this chapter onwards, we are going to discuss different types of market, and markets are classified under different types based on these 5 criteria mainly. So the answers to, or the way these 5 features look like, will differ according to different market types. We begin with studying the perfectly competitive market or perfect competition. Let us first get acquainted with the characteristics of this type of a market. Number of sellers, many. So there are many number of sellers, and we can just write n for that. N denotes many number of sellers. Number of buyers, also n. Okay. Product type, so each seller is selling an identical product or homogeneous good. Okay. Barriers to entry, there are no barriers to entry. In other words, there is free entry and exit into a perfectly competitive industry. Market power, no, neither the buyer nor the seller has any market power. Now, what is market power? Market power is basically the control on the market price. So if, for instance, the seller or the buyer has a control on the market price, then we will say that either the seller or the buyer has market power. But the main characteristic of a perfectly competitive market is that nobody has a control. Each farm or an individual farm or an individual buyer do not have any control on the market price. It is entirely determined in the market of the good by market forces of demand and supply. So for instance, since an example would be, why the seller does not have a market power. First of all, there are too many sellers. So if one seller is charging a price which is higher than the market price, then the buyers will buy from other sellers because everybody is selling identical product. And so the seller who charged a higher price will have to bring the price down to the market level. Now, this type of a market is rare to find, as we will see in most markets, and in the case of manufactured goods at least, there is some kind of a market power because these markets are rarely perfectly competitive. So the closest you can get is probably some agricultural good like wheat or rice, where there is not too many. Even with rice, there is a lot of variety of rice, but maybe with wheat you can get as close to perfect competition as possible, because that would satisfy the criteria of identical product, no differentiation whatsoever. Okay. A perfectly competitive farm. Now, in case of the market, okay, and in case of a perfectly competitive market, where there are n number of farms, right? Sellers are the farms. We have to distinguish between the farm, an individual farm, and the entire industry. The industry is made up of these n number of farms. Okay, so first we are looking at a farm, right? And we are looking at some of these concepts and how a perfectly competitive farm, what kind of demand curve, for example, a perfectly competitive farm faces, what is its marginal revenue and average revenue curves, because all these will finally lead us to find out how a perfectly competitive farm chooses how much output to produce. So before we understand that question and try to answer it, we have to get acquainted with some of the background information. So the first important information is what kind of a demand curve does a perfectly competitive firm face? Now, just to restate, a perfectly competitive firm cannot charge a price which is different from the market price. So and the market price is determined by supply and demand in the market for that good. So if you're talking about the market for wheat, then it is determined by demand and supply in the market for wheat, and an individual wheat farmer will have to accept that price as given. Therefore, the demand curve therefore prices charged for the quantity that is produced or sold by an individual farm or an individual seller um, does not depend on the quantity he or she produces. So it cannot charge different prices for different quantities. So it has to accept P equals P bar as given. Okay, so if we want to plot the farm's demand curve, so the farm faces this demand curve. It's a horizontal demand curve where this is P bar, and P bar is determined. So P bar is determined in the market. P bar is the equilibrium price where demand equals supply, and this demand is market demand, that is all the farms taken together. Okay, marginal revenue and average revenue, these concepts are important. Marginal revenue plays a role in the output determination, as we will see in our next video. So let's try to find out how these look like for a farm which is in a competitive market. So let's start with total revenue. Okay, total revenue, the definition is when you multiply price with quantity, you get total revenue. Okay, so P times Q. Now this P bar is given for each farm because it is determined in the market. Therefore, total revenue is a constant, which is price times Q. Now, average revenue, the definition of average revenue is revenue per unit of output. So total revenue by quantity, which is this term P bar times Q by Q, which is equal to P bar. Therefore, average revenue is also equal to P bar, which means the average revenue curve is the same as the demand curve, right? So this is also the farm's average revenue curve. And then marginal revenue, definition of marginal revenue is change in total revenue when output is increased by 1 unit, okay? Which means this is the change in this number, P bar times Q. And since P bar cannot change, it is a constant, so it is P bar times change in Q over change in Q. So this becomes 1, you can cancel them, so it is basically equal to P bar, which means this is also equal to the marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive farm. Now, when you're talking about the industry as a whole, where you add up all the farms, then remember that the demand curve is the regular downward sloping demand curve. So these uppercase letters show you the industry. Okay, so D is the industry demand curve, Q is the total quantity. So basically Q is the sum of all farms output. Okay, and the farm faces a horizontal demand curve. So this is a very important distinction which may not exist in other types of market, but for a perfectly competitive market, remember the farm faces a horizontal demand curve for the reasons I just explained, and the industry as a whole that has a negatively sloped demand curve. In the next video, we are going to look at how what is the goal of a farm when the farm is choosing a certain level of output. What is the goal it is trying to achieve? Okay, you can before I sign off, you can think of an output like wheat. Okay, because it is more or less homogeneous in nature.